Hello there, I'm Sarah McLusky and this is Research Adjacent. Each episode I talk to amazing research adjacent professionals about what they do and why it makes a difference. Keep listening to find out why we think the research adjacent space is where the real magic happens. Hello there everybody, it's going to be just a solo episode today, so this is me, Sarah, and it's going to be a solo episode for a couple of reasons. The first one is because it is a special occasion. This is our 25th episode and that felt like a milestone worth celebrating. And another reason that it's a solo episode is because I'm going to be on holiday when it comes out. So if you see this in real time, if you see any posts on social media or anything like that, I am not there. Everything has been pre-scheduled. And I don't like to put that on any of my guests to have something come out when I'm not around. So it's just me. And what I'm going to be doing in this episode is I'm going to be reflecting on some of the things that I have learned from my first 25 episodes of the Research Adjacent podcast. And as I've previously mentioned, this podcast really was a bit of an experiment. It was an experiment for me. It was an experiment to see if this was something that people wanted to hear about. And my initial goal was just to do 10 episodes. And here we are at episode 25. And I have so enjoyed the conversations that I have had, and I've been learning so much along the way that I thought I would share some of those things. So some of the things I'm going to be talking about in this episode are that no one has a straightforward career path, that sometimes opportunities come in disguise, that research adjacent jobs are all about people and transferable skills, and that it is definitely not essential to be a researcher in order to be a great research adjacent professional. But the first thing that I want to say before I get into talking about some of those things is that the first thing I have learned is what an amazing group of people research adjacent professionals are. The response to this podcast has been so encouraging, and I've been really touched by comments and encouragement that people have given me, that when people have shared posts and sent me feedback and just generally been lovely about the whole thing. And I'm so touched. And the guests I've had on have been so generous with their time and so honest with the stories that they've shared. And I'm really grateful for that as well. And I'm just really pleased that the whole idea of the podcast seems to have struck a chord. And so one thing that I want to do as I keep going with the podcast is keep making it better so that it serves you. And to help me do that, I have got a short survey to mark this 25th episode, and you will find a link in the show notes. It's just 10 questions, it's anonymous, you don't have to answer all the questions, and I'd be really grateful if you'd maybe take a little bit of time to go and fill in that survey so that I can keep making this podcast better for you, the people who are listening. So the first thing that I have noticed from all the guests I've spoken to is that no one has a straightforward career path. And I'm a big fan of the Squiggly Careers podcast, and they talk about embracing the squiggle in careers, which means careers that go off in ways that you didn't expect. And so embracing the squiggle is something that I've been doing with my own career for a long time. But what I didn't realise is that it's not just me. And so many of my guests, and I've been talking to them, have also had very squiggly career paths. And so if you're in a situation where you're looking at where your career is going, you feel like you're squiggling all over the place, then there's nothing wrong with you. And many of the guests that I've had on are doing something now that they would never have predicted if they had held on really tightly to that idea of following a linear career. So embrace the squiggle. That's my first lesson. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that often opportunities come in disguise. And so many of these come out of what might actually be your biggest fear when it comes to work. So what is your biggest fear when it comes to work? Is it redundancy? Is it getting stuck in a job that you hate? Even being so sick that you can't work, or being really underemployed and underpaid? And they all sound pretty bad. But many of my guests have turned these kind of setbacks into career defining moments or pathways to success. For example, one of my early guests, Faye Watson, she quit her PhD with no idea of what she was going to do next, and she is now being really successful in public engagement. Jed Hall took voluntary redundancy to get out of a job where he wasn't happy and move into something which he now feels much more fulfilled in. And Sam Alexandra Rose, who was just on a couple of weeks ago, turned her experiences of cancer into a whole new career as a patient involvement manager. So sometimes opportunities come when you're least expecting it. Another thing that I have noticed is how many of my guests talk about temporary jobs, short contracts, things like that, which help them to get their foot in the door and led to bigger and better things. Particularly the last guest, Lorna Wilson, and she began her career in research development with a temp job from an agency. And Orla Kelly, who came in on a short contract to see if a job would work out and has now been moved on to permanent contracts. So sometimes these things lead on to bigger and better things. Although they can be really hard in the moment, they aren't necessarily the end of the world. The next thing that I've learned is that research adjacent work is all about people. Virtually every single guest that I've had on has said that they are in their job because they love working with people. And this is particularly true of the people who had been working in research earlier and then have moved into research adjacent work. And I think it possibly might be the thing that truly unites research adjacent jobs. I've always got a bit of an eye out for, what is it about these things that's the same? And how can we connect them? And definitely working with people is a really, really common thing. So if you're not currently research adjacent, but you love working with people, it could be the place for you. Another thing I've noticed about research adjacent jobs is that they are all about what's often called transferable skills. They are more about what you can do rather than what you know. And that's a bit of a I think that's one of the reasons why they maybe don't quite fit into the sort of academic world, because traditional academia is about what you know. And that is not the case for research adjacent roles. But because they're about what you can do rather than what you know, they're really flexible. And it means that you can move to seemingly very different roles which use the same skills. And I think that is also the reason why research adjacent careers often seem quite squiggly, because it's taking those those skills that you've got and applying them in different careers. So really focusing on those things is important for success in this area. And then another thing I have noticed is around this question of whether you need to understand research to be research adjacent. And certainly in some places I've worked, there has been a kind of underlying assumption that if you want to be effective in a research adjacent role, you need to have some kind of research background. But this connects back to my last point about transferable skills. And I think it's not about what you know, but about what you can do. And several of my guests have succeeded in this area, absolutely not having had a research background. And there's guests like PR turned science writer Melissa Hobson, filmmaker turned research communicator Peter Barker, and even shop owner turned coach Jenny Brady. And they prove that having a research background is absolutely not necessary, and in fact sometimes a real gift to have that different perspective on it. And I love the quote that Melissa gave on this when we were talking about it. And she said, "I genuinely thought that a comms person couldn't get into marine conservation without retraining to be a biologist. So I spoke to a shark scientist for advice, and he was like, 'Are you kidding? We have scientists. What we desperately need is communications people.'" And I think that is a really nice point there on this idea of it being about what you can do, not about what you know. So, a short episode today, but those are some of the things that I have learned from 25 episodes. There are some other things as well that when I started to go into it, I thought this is a whole episode all on its own. So hopefully some of those will come up at some point in the future. But I would love to hear what you've learned from the first 25 episodes, or the 2 episodes that you've listened to, whatever it is. And a great way to share those thoughts with me is to fill in that survey that I mentioned to help me make the podcast even better. And if you do want to support the podcast, the best thing to do is to subscribe or follow the podcast in your podcast app. And then also find me on social media too. LinkedIn is the best place to connect with both me and the podcast. So it just remains to say thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And if you're listening to this in real time, I will be thinking about this coming out live whilst I am off on holiday, but I will also be doing my best to ignore my social media and my emails whilst I'm away. So I will look forward to seeing you again next time for episode 26. Thank you. Bye. Thanks for listening to Research Adjacent. You can find show notes and other episodes at researchadjacent.com. I would absolutely love to hear what you think of the show, so please get in touch. You can drop us a message via researchadjacent.com or find us on social media at resadjacent. And if you've enjoyed the show, please think about sharing it, subscribing or leaving a review so that other people can find us too. Research Adjacent is presented and produced by Sarah McLusky, and you, yes you, get a big gold star for listening right to the end. See you next time.